Welcome in, everyone, to another edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host, as always, Tommy Brzee. It is Tuesday, September 10th around here, and we have a great show for you today. We're going to start trying to make a little bit of sense of the college football world right now. I'll break teams up into some tiers that aren't necessarily rankings of these teams, but just necessarily kind of breaking them down into groups just to make it a little bit more digestible, because the first 2 weeks have been a little bit off the charts, all over the place, that we're going to need to break it down into simpler terms at the very least. Then we'll get into some winners and losers from this past week. Definitely some big-time winners, including us, the fans. I think might have been the biggest winners from this last week. Then we'll get into a little bit of a whip around. Didn't quite get to all the games that I wanted to get to yesterday, so we'll do a quick whip around to, I believe, 10 different games, so we'll go pretty quickly there. Then we'll get to questions from week 2, a ton of questions, including who are your Heisman favorites as of right now. I'd love to hear from you guys, but I have 3 names that I think are standing a little bit above the pack as of right now. And then I'll finish it off with my top 12 Tuesday. Very, very tough to put together. I'll be totally honest. This is a group that is very, very tough because you're trying to figure out between what you thought in the preseason and what you have seen on the field. Trying to weigh those two is not an easy thing to do. But before we jump in, I do want to remind you all we get tons of questions and comments throughout the show. And the best way for you all to get your question on the screen, we can have a fun back and forth here, is to use that super chat at the bottom of the chat on the Sports Network page. You can just click that little plus or that $sign. You can add a question you'd like, your name, and the question will pop up on the screen, and we can have a fun back and forth here. And that's always what I want. Definitely want this to be interactive, so utilize that if you'd like. And the GSMCpodcast.net page is still up and working if you would like to use that. But let's go ahead and jump in here, and let's try to make sense of college football right about now, because there were a couple of teams that were coming in that have just not played very good football right now. Florida State, Michigan, Oregon, all of those teams you felt like at the very least had a shot to make a playoff run, and it's looked very, very clunky thus far. And then you have some teams that look like they are on cruise control, like Ole Miss, Missouri, but haven't quite played anyone. And then you have the statement teams. You have Miami that has played really, really good football, but you also still have the ACC coming up. Not really sure how they're going to adapt to that. So there's a ton of different things to kind of take into account here, but let's start to break this down into tiers, because I feel like that's the easiest way to go about this. Now, these tiers are not necessarily, I think these teams are better than these teams, but the first tier is, to be totally fair. But beyond that, I think it's just grouping these teams together and giving you an idea of who's playing the best on the field, who's executing on the field, but not necessarily I'm fully sold on. And then you have teams that are struggling right now, but then maybe could turn a corner later on. And there's more teams in these tiers than I'm showing on the screen, but I'll break those down as we go. For the cream of the crop, it's these 3 teams. I feel pretty confident in that. Ohio State's the one that you would obviously have the question about, because haven't necessarily played anyone yet. If you watch that team play football, it is as clean as anything you've ever seen. They are on cruise control right now, and everything is coming into place for this team roughly the way that I expected it would. So I have no interest in, dinging them too much, because they're playing the team in front of them. So at the end of the day, I think these 3 teams have separated themselves. I still think Georgia sits atop, that we'll get to at the very end, but I do think these are the teams that everyone's chasing as of right now, but there are teams that are not too far behind them. I think we have a couple of teams that people are questioning, people definitely still have questions about, but have made a statement thus far through the season, and I think it's these 3 teams right here: Tennessee, USC, and Miami. I think when you talk about Tennessee going to NC State, or going to Charlotte technically, and beating NC State the way they did was incredible. And it wasn't necessarily about the score line. 51-10 obviously looks really great, but at the end of the day, it was about the way they went about business. They ran the ball, they played defense, they did it in a way that you would not think a Josh Heupel Tennessee team could do it. So that's kind of the big thing to me, where this is not the same Tennessee team. This is not a Tennessee team that has to score 50 points to beat you. They could have scored 11 on Saturday, and they still would have beat NC State. So it's a really impressive team. And then you have USC, who beat LSU, obviously. Still have questions about that defense, but when you have Anthony Lucas playing the football that he's playing right now, a lot of things fall into place. That is an elite athlete guy that's going to play on Sundays and is really showing it this year. Excuse me. And then Miami is likely the group that you would have at the very top of this list. Came out in week 1, looked incredible against Florida, and looked the part against Florida A&M this past weekend. So it's one of those teams that I think people still have questions about them fully, going through a full season and not having any clunky parts. But at the end of the day, they look like a well-oiled machine. So I'm going to treat them that way, at least for the time being. Very, very impressive performances thus far. And I don't see them stopping anytime soon necessarily, especially with the way the ACC is shaking out right about now. But the teams taking care of business are Missouri and Ole Miss, in my opinion. I think there's more in this group, obviously. Ohio State could be in this group, but I still think they're a little bit above the rest of college football. But Ole Miss and Missouri have just rolled over their opponents, and it's been relatively easy opponents, let's be honest. But at the end of the day, we will get to see what Missouri can do against a pretty good opponent this week against Thomas Castellanos and Boston College. I think we'll break that game down tomorrow, so be on the lookout for that. But it's one of those things where I like both these teams. I think they're going to be great teams throughout the season. I have worries about both these teams' defenses, and I haven't necessarily seen a team that can challenge what I'm worried about. So I think once we get into SEC play, even this weekend, I will be able to see a lot from Missouri that will give me a better idea of where they stand. But as of right now, they're doing exactly what you need to do, right? Ole Miss looks like a well-oiled machine. Missouri, the exact same. And the worry I have for Ole Miss down the line is I worry about Pete Golding. I think he's a good defensive coordinator. I don't know if he's a defensive coordinator that can stop UGA or that can stop Alabama. So that's the worry that I have. We'll find out later in the season, but they don't play Alabama this season. I apologize. Stop LSU's offense. But at the end of the day, I do think these are both incredible teams and will continue to develop. So maybe both these teams just continue to roll. They continue to take care of business, and maybe one of them finds their way into Atlanta. But as of right now, I think they're doing exactly what I expected them to do, but want to see a little bit more as we get deeper into the season. They start playing bigger opponents. But then you get into the confusing crew, and there are way more teams than those three in that crew. When I talk about Alabama, Penn State, Oregon, Utah, Clemson, all of those teams are about as confusing as can be, and then you could add other teams in there. If you wanted to add Michigan, if you wanted to add Oklahoma, if you wanted to add LSU, there are a number of teams that you could throw into this group, but they're just teams that you've seen holes. You've seen worries that are very, very real. For Alabama, the O-line is just not as good as it needs to be. And a lot of that is because they've had to move people around with Caden Proctor getting injured. I think once they get Caden Proctor back, which I don't really know when that's going to be, but whenever that does happen, you can slide Tyler Booker back on the inside, and then hopefully you'll get a little bit more of a push in the run game. But then the back end is a problem. They look like they're a very athletic group and a very talented group on that back end. USF had multiple open receivers throughout that game that just were not hit. And they were hit, then maybe we're looking at a different result from Alabama this past weekend. So I think that's the big worry for me. It's a lot of things that haven't necessarily been fully exposed yet, but once you get into SEC play, especially when you play Georgia, they're going to get exposed in a hurry if you do not fix them. So a little bit confusing there. I think Penn State is another team that they just left a lot on the table in last week. And to be fair, Bowling Green is a very good team. Bowling Green is a team that could absolutely win the MAC. Frankly, I might have them winning the MAC right about now. But overall, I think when you look at this team, they can get things back on track. A lot of things have improved. I worry about that defense just a little bit, but I think they'll mostly be fine, and we'll see what they do in conference play. Oregon, I'm worried about. I don't think there's any two ways about that. The O-line does not look great, and you can get Matthew Bedford back. It's not going to fix all the problems that they have on that offensive line. It looked bad against Boise State, and I can promise you Ohio State's going to get after you a little bit better than Boise State does. So they're going to have issues in those big-time games. And they also have not hit explosive plays at all this year. And that's a worry with Dylan Gabriel at quarterback that people talked about throughout the offseason was you're not necessarily losing ability. You're not necessarily losing a guy that can, run this offense efficiently. You are losing those big-time plays, and they need to figure that out in a hurry, or it's going to be a weird season for Oregon where they feel like they left a lot on the table. Utah is just a matter of Cam Rising going down. If he's healthy, I feel very confident in what they can do. If he's not, by Oklahoma State at the very least, I have some big-time worries. So we'll update you on that as we get a little bit closer to their game on Saturday. Hopefully he goes on Saturday, but at the very least, he needs to go against Oklahoma State in a couple of weeks. And then Clemson is one of those that they don't necessarily fit in terms of rank of these teams, but when I look at this team, they ran into a wagon of Georgia in week one, looked incredible last week. I'm having a hard time pinning them in any way, whether it's bad or good. So I'm going to leave them alone for the time being. They're right in that kind of gray area where I think this is still a really good team, if I'm being totally honest, but I still have my big time questions about that offense, obviously. But then you have the grab bag. You have teams that Kansas State, Oklahoma, NC State, Michigan, Louisiana, or Louisville, not Louisiana, Louisville, Nebraska. You can include any types of teams in this group, and it's really just teams that have had one big win, have had one close loss to one of these other teams up there, have had, weird moments, have had good moments, teams that are just a little bit all over the place through 2 weeks, and you have more than one question. That team, that group that we just got into, it feels like there's one central question around those. I think with these teams, you have a number of others, and then you have a conference schedule in a lot of these cases that could very well get in their way to get any type of CFP run. So I think when you look at these teams, it's a lot of the Big 12, obviously, because pretty much that entire conference is a grab bag right about now. But I do think there are a number of teams. Iowa State could be included in here. There are so many different teams that can make some noise. And then you have the dark horses, the funnest group in the early parts of the year, because there are some weird teams here. When you talk about Syracuse, Boston College, Illinois, Vandy, Cal, all of these teams are playing pretty good football right about now. Now, I don't necessarily think they're going to make runs to a college football playoff, but let's just see how long they can keep it going. If Boston College goes over to Missouri this weekend and gets a big-time win, we got to start talking about them as a team that can possibly make an ACC run, and then things get really interesting. So it's one of those things where I don't necessarily expect any of these teams to make long-term runs, but really fun to see them in the mix right about now, and I really want them to stay that way, especially Syracuse. I'm having a lot of fun with Fran Brown and the Orange right about now, but then you have the group of 5 hopefuls. You have UNLV, in my opinion, is leading the way right now, have looked just incredible through 2 weeks, although that Houston win is looking a little questionable right about now. Boise State is the team that everyone is watching and has been watching since preseason, and then Northern Illinois has the biggest win of the bunch. Maybe they're the team to beat, to be totally fair, as of right now. But I do think that there is a world where Memphis is in this group, obviously. Tulane's in this group. You have so many different teams that will, fluctuate in and out of this group throughout the year. But I feel pretty good that at the end of the year, we're going to be talking about Boise State, we're going to be talking about UNLV, we're going to be talking about Memphis, and we're going to be talking about Tulane. I worry a little bit about Northern Illinois. I think they're a really good team, but I think that MAC is so tough to come out just unscathed that they're going to get got at some point and maybe a couple of times throughout the season. So I do think this is a really, really fun exercise. When you're breaking down all of the different craziness that has gone on through 2 weeks, it's nearly impossible to peg down who is good, who is bad, and who is somewhere in between. And I'm doing my very best to figure it out. But this didn't even include teams like UCF, South Carolina, Washington, Kansas, Iowa, all teams that are going to have something to say. Washington, I'm not necessarily as high on as the other. South Carolina, kind of the same thing. But at the end of the day, all of these teams could have something to say. And then I refuse to talk about Notre Dame. They do not deserve to be in this conversation. They are not a college football playoff team. I will ride that to the very end of the year, even if they roll the rest of the year. I'm sticking by that. If you let Northern Illinois walk into your building and beat you, that's it. You're done. I hate the 12-team playoff because that's not it, but it should be it, and I'm going to stick to that till the very end. But let's take our first break here, and when we come back, we're going to talk about the winners and the losers from Week 2. There were a couple of big-time winners, and the biggest of all of them is us, the college football fans, because it was a great Saturday. But we'll break down that along with all of the other winners and losers from Week 2 right after this, so stick with us.